Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today I'm here with Christopher Tomaszewski and Gil Sanders. Both of them have been on the show before, and this time I'm really excited to have them together talking about existential inertia. So obviously we have a good friend of ours. I think it's okay to drop his name. His name is Joe Schmid. He's been talking a lot about existential inertia. I think he even had a paper. Yes, he had a paper published by the International Journal of the Philosophy of Religion, if I'm not mistaken. So that was a huge accomplishment, and honestly, I'm proud of him. But we fundamentally disagree on the thesis that's at play in that paper. So I have Christopher and Gil to talk about it today. Since I've had Gil and Christopher on before, I'm not really going to have them introduce themselves. If you guys don't know who these guys are, then you're missing out. But anyway, let me just give the laydown, or the rundown, excuse me, of how today's episode will go. So one is that we're just going to try and define existential inertia and see its relevance. We're going to try and be charitable and just say what we think can be said in its favor, why someone might want to adopt this perspective. And then a little bit about the dialectic of the whole debate, who has the burden of proof. And then finally, the main thing that probably everyone's here for is what exactly are the problems with existential inertia? So let me just start off by asking then, let's define what this idea is, right? What is existential inertia, and what is its relevance to classical theistic arguments? Maybe I'll have Christopher go first, and then we'll talk to Gil.
Sure. So let me start off by saying that this is a very hard topic. As I was preparing to do this episode, I found myself continually thinking I had a grasp on what existential inertia was, and then losing it again, and it's like it felt like playing with Play-Doh. It kept losing my grasp on it, and one reason for that, and this will be like partly an explanation of what existential inertia is, partly an autobiographical note of like the way I think about things. But the way it's traditionally defined, right, is that that things in which essence and existence are distinct require a continuously concurrent conserving cause, right, to exist going into the future. So it's not sufficient, right, that God, like a deist God, create things and wind them up and let them go on their merry way, but rather, right, at every moment at which they exist, they have to be sustained by God's ongoing causal activity, or else they will, by their very nature, slip back into nothingness. This is both St. Thomas Aquinas' view. It is also the dogma of the Catholic Church for those of us who are Catholic, as defined at Vatican I and elsewhere and attested to in Scripture. I should say that there's some kind of conserving activity on the part of God is defined by the church and attested to in Scripture. What the metaphysical details are, of course, will be more complicated than that, and not the subject of doctrinal concern necessarily. Right, but so here's where I kind of have trouble with that. Is that the doctrine, existential inertia versus, what I'll call the doctrine of divine conservation, is seemingly a dispute about what's happening to creatures, about what's happening to beings in which essence and existence are distinct at every moment that they exist. And I actually, for my part, although that's the way most people talk about it, and I think in that formulation, it is true that they need conserving causes at every moment, I tend to shy away from this characterization of at every moment, because I think, questions crop up in my mind. I'm like, at every moment, like at whose every moment? Because I don't think there's just one every moment, across every creature, right? Scientifically, relativity tells us that. But also, I think Aquinas tells us that, right? That there's different times in which different kinds of creatures, at least, if not different token creatures, exist, right? Angels have a very different kind of time than we do. And in general, right, like moments of time, as Aquinas would define it, or at least as Thomas would define it, as Aristotle defines it, right, is the numbering of before and after in change. And so when we're talking about how things are from moment to moment, I think it's best to talk about how that thing is from its moment to its next moment. That is from how it is now to how it is in the next moment that it exists, if it's undergoing some kind of change. And so one way in which you could get the doctrine in that formulation to be trivially true, and this is part of why I think this formulation is perhaps not the most helpful way of talking about it, is to just create something that never changes, right? God just creates something that never changes. That thing won't have any moments, so to speak, right? Because again, time is the numbering of change according to before and after. If there is no before and after because there is no change, then there are no moments, and therefore it's just trivially true that thing exists from moment to moment as a result of divine conserving activity, simply because there are no moments for that thing. Now, I don't think that's actually true of any creature. I think all creatures do change, but there's different ways that different creatures change, and therefore different ways that different creatures proceed from moment to moment. And so the way I like to actually characterize it is to think about whether God's creative activity in creating creatures is exercised as a power in a per accidens series or as a per se series, right? Whenever we're talking about God's imparting being to creatures, are we talking about a causal series that is per se or per accidens? And I think if we can, I think that we should characterize the thesis of the doctrine of divine conservation as the doctrine that all of God's causal exercises of his creative power are exercised in a per se series rather than a per accidens series, such that all subsequent comings to be or goings out of existence, as the case may be, on the part of creatures, finds its way back to God as the first cause that gives these things not only their becoming, but also their being. And since you mentioned Joe, I'll just note that I think Joe would agree with me on this, since on page 9, he entertains an objection that talks about the distinction between per se and per accidens causal series, and says that whether the existence of concrete objects constitutes a per se series depends on whether they wholly derive their present existence from a continuously concurrent sustaining cause. And he's saying that to illustrate that the objection at hand is question begging, but he's essentially agreeing, I think, with me, right, that the question of divine conservation is, or the question of existential inertia, let's put it that way, is hand in hand with the question of whether the causal power exercised by the first cause is exercised in a per se series rather than a per accidens series. I've been talking too long, so I'll let Gil give his take on things.
Yeah, real quick, for the audience who maybe they're not familiar with like what per se and per accidens mean, can you just introduce them to that idea real quick?
Yeah. And yeah, I'll just note, like, this is part of what makes this topic particularly hard, is because it presupposes so many other Aristotelian Thomistic doctrines, and it takes a long time to try to dig down into each one and see how the whole structure goes together. Okay, so when we're talking about causal powers getting exercised through intermediate objects, we can characterize how those powers get exercised in two different ways. In a per accidens or horizontal way, right? And there the paradigm example is the way in which a father generates a son, who generates a son of his own, who generates a son of his own, and so on. Where, and this will come back up as I try later on to give some arguments against existential inertia, where each member of the series possesses intrinsically and without any dependence on any prior member of the series, the power to perpetuate the series, right? So at least when I became a mature man, right, I came to have the power to generate a son of my own, and that power in me in no way depends on my father. When I exercise it, I don't exercise it in a way that's dependent upon my father in any way. And in fact, I can exercise it even if my father were dead, as people often do. Whereas a per se series is a series where the causal power of each member in the series to perpetuate the series depends ultimately on the original member. So the classic example here is of someone holding a stick that pushes a rock. The stick is moving the rock, but only because the hand is pushing it. And if at any moment the hand ceases to push the stick, the stick will cease to push the stone. At every moment that it's exercising any causal power, the stick depends for its possession of that causal power on the hand, and so on, right? And of course, there's nothing special about that having 3 members. It could have a lot more. And so the idea here, right, is that when God creates, the way in which creatures depend for their powers and even their very existence on God is in a per se way, not in a per accidens way. The per se series is also sometimes called a hierarchical series to contrast with the horizontalness of the per accidens series. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's really good. So Gil, I mean, give me your thoughts. Do you have a different definition? How do you conceive of the whole issue at hand?
Yeah, I think it's really important to kind of understand how we frame this issue, because I would agree a lot with Chris here in terms of how we frame it, because a lot of times how it's framed is going to be framed from a more analytic perspective. And that kind of focuses on logical conditionals, and it focuses on less on substances and more on state of affairs and all that sort of thing. Whereas a Thomist is very much oriented towards substances as the fundamental thing, that everything is reducible to substances in some way. And so that's why we kind of really hesitate to talk about temporal or times, and like we're treating time as slices or as like spatial locations of sorts. We're more oriented or understanding time as a measure of change, and a change of substances in particular. Not just change in general of a state of affairs, but the change of substances. So I think it's really important that we frame it that way, and I think that's what causes a lot of confusion. But nonetheless, I think it's important to understand how they frame it, because then we can understand better where we can cross that bridge and kind of like facilitate some kind of discussion and understanding amongst each other. So from what I've seen of how they understand it, so first off, just to provide some context, why is this important? Why is existential inertia important? So, we observe things existing, right? That's one thing. But we do observe them persisting in existence. It seems to me that I am the same person I was 10 minutes ago, and I'm identical to that person 10 minutes ago. There are things that are simply persisting through time that are the same exact kind of thing. And so they have existence at every single moment at that time that they exist. And that's how we typically would understand it. So we have this data or datum by which we observe these things taking place, of things persisting. Now, the question that we have to encounter then is, why does the thing continue to exist? By virtue of what does it continue to exist? Is there any explanation by which it continues to exist? So there are 2 broad views that we can broadly kind of state here. And it'll be kind of pretty similar to what Christopher's already mentioned. But the first view is existential inertia. And so that's just how I define it, is that after an object is caused to exist, it will continue to exist without a concurrent sustaining cause unless impeded. So what that basically means is that existential inertia is not talking about the initial moment in which that object exists. God could have caused that object for all they know. It's compatible with that, at least some version of theism. What they want to say is that Well, after it exists, though, once it's been given existence, then it can continue to exist without it being constantly caused to exist at that moment. Unless there's some kind of like impeding destructive causal factor that's destroying it. It could be internal too, like dynamite. Dynamite, after some time, has an internal kind of destruction. It destroys itself after a while. So it could be extrinsic or some internal explanation for why that thing ceases to be. But the idea is that, normally speaking, it seems like they will persist in existence unless destroyed. And there are different views on how to understand that. There's one view that it's metaphysically necessary to obtain, or simply a primitive fact that's attained. Some people apply it to different things. You might have the global thesis, as Joe kind of points out. It could be that everything has existential inertia, whether it's property, state of affairs, objects, even non-fundamental entities. That could be one thing. But there is also the thesis that it just applies to fundamental entities. It just applies to like concrete objects. So there is some wiggle room in terms of how you're going to interpret existential inertia, and there's also different metaphysical accounts of it, which we'll get to later, I think, as we kind of address it and we try to make some objections to it. So that's often adopted, like Oppie, Audi, and Schmid, and Bourdieu, if I'm pronouncing that right. These are kind of like the pretty contemporary defenders of existential inertia. Now, the second thing is divine conservation, which Chris already basically defined. And this is how they kind of understand existential inertia when I see it defined by Schmid in particular. So I'm kind of paraphrasing and providing my own kind of more definition here, but this is what basically what divine conservation is that after an object is caused to exist, it will continue to exist only if, one, there is a concurrent sustaining cause, namely God, that keeps it in existence at every single moment, and two, nothing impedes it. So as Chris was mentioned, this is has like a strong precedence throughout the history of philosophy, and it's particularly Christianity. We see this in Augustine, we see it in Aquinas, Suarez, we see it in Scripture itself. In Hebrews, he upholds all things in existence. We see in the Roman Catholic Church and the traditions that it's uphold, that something has to be caused by God at every single moment. So to quote from Aquinas more directly, he says this: "Both reason and faith bind us to say that creatures are kept in being by God. The being of every creature depends on God, so that not for a moment could it subsist, but would fall into nothingness were it not kept in being by the operation of the divine power," as Gregory says. And so that's one of the key texts of Aquinas that shows like, hey, this is a pretty serious doctrine here. This is something that they adopt. But it's also important to note, Aquinas says something else as well, which is typically neglected from what I've seen in the literature so far. He also says, "But everything which already has being naturally loves its being, and with all its strength preserves it." So I think this is pretty important because it affirms that things, in a sense, have a tendency to persist. We're not saying that there's no tendency at all to persist, but we're simply saying that this tendency to persist is simply a necessary condition. It's not sufficient for things actually persisting. You're going to actually need a cause, something that's pure act, an event at the end of the day to cause that. So that would be my general introduction, like as far as how this whole discussion is framed. Not sure.
Yeah, let me add a little bit more to that because I just picked up my copy of Ott from my desk because I wanted to talk a little bit more about the tradition here. Well, before I get into that, let me agree very much with Gil that this is not a dispute about whether things do or do not have an inherent tendency to persist. I think everybody on both sides of this dispute should agree that they do. Things do have an inherent tendency to persist, absent, right, some kind of external destructive cause. The question is, what is the ultimate origin of that tendency, right? Does that tendency in some way or another find its way back to God? And if it does, how does it find its way back to God? That gets back to the per se versus per accident series. Or is it some kind of brute metaphysical fact that doesn't have any explanation, or at least no explanation that goes back to God? But yeah, so as I said, for Catholics at least, that God keeps all created things in existence is de fide. It's of the faith, which is the highest level of doctrinal authority. Vatican I taught God by his providence protects all that he has created. The Roman Catechism, which came out of the Council of Trent, says, if his providence did not preserve all things with the same power with which they were created, important word, same power. In the beginning, they would fall back into nothingness immediately. And then lots of good scripture passages Ott gives us here. So Wisdom 11:26 says, and how could anything endure if thou wouldst not, or be preserved if not called by thee? John 5:17, my Father worketh until now, and I work. Colossians 1:17, and by him all things consist. Hebrews 1:3 that Gil mentioned, he upholdeth all things by the word of his power. St. Augustine comments on John 5:17 that I mentioned before, my Father worketh until now. His commentary says, let us therefore believe that God works constantly, so that all created things would perish if his working were withdrawn. That's from his literal interpretation of Genesis, book 5. So yeah, it's very firmly planted in the theological tradition, and is considered to be as authoritative as it gets, at least in the Catholic Church. It's worth noting.
All right, so then let's move on then to talk about what can be at least said in its favor. So, let's try to be charitable, right? And how can we steel man this position and really, not be accused, right, of being uncharitable or just dismissing it outright? So what can be said in its favor? Let me start with Gil, and then I'll go to Christopher.
Okay. I actually kind of wanted to talk about real quick about its significance to theism in particular. I just, because what Krista was saying really just hit it home, I think, in a way, just how essential this teaching is to the Christian faith. Because what's happens here, if you kind of like adopt this view that existential inertia is something that's possible, at least possible, you kind of have an idea of God as a watchmaker, kind of like a deistic view in which God just simply creates the watch and then it's just suddenly it's already wound up, so it continues operating without God's concurrent sustaining of it. And I think this is a pretty dangerous view for Christians to adopt. I've seen some Christians kind of, especially more of the theistic personalists, I don't want to overgeneralize though, some of them at least, kind of have a tendency to be more accepting of this. And they'll say, well, our arguments don't depend on this existential inertia. We can simply say that there still needs to be an initial cause of existence. And I think that's kind of problematic in various ways. It just seems to be like, well, okay, here you concluded that God initiated things now. Now God could just simply, does nothing at this point. And how do you get to this personal God that we know Scripture has revealed himself, who is holding things? And you could say, well, okay, now that we've proved God exists, it seems like, okay, then God's the best explanation then for why things persist, because now we have God in our ontology. But at the same time, that just simply seems accidental. Like, yeah, you're just, now that you have God and you brought God into existence because you have some argument for it. Now it's just like, well, why does he sustain it? It's kind of because he has to in a way, but what about the nature of things makes it such that he has to? Because you've already conceded that it's possible for things to persist without God, at least in principle. So that God continues to persist, it simply seems like almost accident, like an accident, like he just happens to be there at the right time to be able to preserve it, but it's not necessary. And I think that's a serious problem. So I think classical theism kind of seems to make the most sense of the essentials of the Christian faith, in particular this doctrine, because it holds that God has to preserve things in existence, and it's not an accident, it's necessary, built into the very nature of things in the world. So I think that's pretty significant in terms of what this has, the consequences of this discussion has on God's existence. And even more fundamentally, though, I think at its core, this is fundamentally a metaphysical debate, a question, as Chris already mentioned, because how we respond to this is going to depend on what view we have on like the nature of composites, necessity, possibility, causality, explanation, our view of time, as Chris already mentioned, and the nature of essence and existence. So this is really fundamental stuff. So when we delve into this, it's gonna have a lot of consequences. We're gonna really be unraveling those ideas as we go about this. And so I think a way to frame this is really, it's gonna ultimately come down to like a Thomistic versus analytic approach to the nature, especially of existence, because that's what we're talking about. What is existence? Can existence be conceptualized? Is it something that something is? Can we say something about it? There's a lot of questions, very deep, perplexing questions when it comes to existence. And so how you understand existence is really going to affect how we proceed with this. And so that's why I think this is a really significant discussion. I'm not sure if Chris wants to add anything to that, but.
No, I was going to start jumping into. I was going to say something about why you might think existential inertia is true, but if you want to do that first, Gil, since
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so there are quite a few arguments that we could probably say in favor of it. I guess one of the arguments that's used is that an argument from intuition. So there seems to be nothing incoherent about a thing continuing to exist without a concurrent sustaining cause, at least not initially. We don't see any contradiction, any explicit contradiction in something persisting. So I think that, okay, if that's the case, and it's the analogy that maybe like Chris already gave, you know, the famous analogy of the father begetting a son persists without the father, right? If the son doesn't need it, the father to continue existence. It seems like maybe existence really is that way. Maybe it operates in a similar fashion, perhaps not identically, but as a rough analogy, you might say that seems intuitive, and that seems to kind of give like a plausible case, at least initially, for existential inertia. And the second one that they'd probably give is simplicity. So I'm not sure if you guys want me to run down through all these arguments for existential inertia, if we want to take it down each individually. But one of the arguments is simplicity. So they were posit that say something like, well, we don't need to posit an extra amount of causes, like God, namely, or some other sustaining cause that preserves it into being. We don't need to apply that. So we also we eliminate an entire category as well. So we eliminate concurrent sustaining causes. So it seems that existential inertia has an advantage both in terms of qualitative simplicity and also in terms of quantitative simplicity, because it's positing less entities and one less kind of entity. So it seems to have that in its favor. And another argument, which I'm going to be borrowing kind of from Joe when he had this discussion of Micah, he kind of gave this argument in favor. He says that imagine we flipped the coin 10 times and we got head 10 times. Now we know that this is it's incredibly improbable. But the question is then, is existence persisting like this? Like, you know, you flip a coin, you get one moment of time, you flip another coin, you get it heads, it exists, and it keeps existing, you know, but if you got tails, then it would stop existing. So is existence kind of like that? Because we have existence persisting like that. Does reality persist from moment to moment? So it seems, and if we kind of treat as existence as kind of like a 50-50 chance of going in, might be that existence is such that of any second that's going to be subsequent to this moment, there's this 50-50 chance of it existing or not existing. We could just all immediately blank out of existence. And there have been billions of these moments. So it's just Smith kind of talks about then the probability of the temporal reality would persist right now is 1/2 to the power upon trillions and trillions. And so that's like, well, if it has a 1/2 chance, and that's a big problem, because the more you multiply the trillions upon trillions, the more improbable it is that something will continue existing, just as you would if you continue flipping a coin. The more improbable it will be, the more times you flip it, that you'll get heads. And same thing with existence. So he kind of wants to use this Bayesian probability argument to kind of confirm the existential inertia thesis, because the existential inertia thesis is that there's a certain kind of primitive metaphysical necessity such that things will continue to persist in existence unless impeded. And so he says, if we take that view, then the probability of things will continue is just one. There's just one there. So there's no like uncertainties, no unexplicable things coming in and out of existence. You know, it's just one that things will continue to exist, because once they exist, they will persist to exist necessarily. And so, but then he compares this to like the theistic worldview, which is that if God is free, if he has free will with respect to sustaining temporary reality, then it seems like there's less than a 1 probability that God continues to sustain it. So even if we want to say that's like just slightly less, like 0.99999, you know, that God sustains temporal reality every moment. But then because of the fact that we've had like trillions of these moments, it seems like, well, that 0.99 is going to turn into like 0.000000001 that it continue to persist in existence, because, you know, there's billions, if not trillions of these moments. So it seems that for existential inertia, then it has an advantage insofar as that it's necessarily the case that it persists. So the probability is always 1 as long as you don't postulate any destructive forces. Whereas with divine conservation, that doesn't seem to be the case. So it seems to be very problematic, given God's freedom, that there would be any kind of reality persisting at this moment. So it seemed to have like some kind of explanatory advantage there. And then another thing is like what I would kind of categorize as explanatory power. They would say that existential inertia seems to have the advantage of explanatory power. So one of the things that Joe Schmidt appeals to is that it best explains why we do not observe concurrent sustaining causes. So it doesn't seem to us that we have like, you know, an example of that in reality. So every example that we can give, whatever we can give of things like, you know, a table being like a book's being upheld by a table and a table being upheld by the floor, you know, he would say like, well, you know, there's always different causal factors. So if we remove the table, then the books don't continue to, you know, they won't continue to float. But like that isn't necessarily, that's just a state of affairs. So we're not talking about concurrent sustaining cause of existence per se. We're simply talking about a certain state of affairs that's being upheld, but that's not what the type of concurrent sustaining causes that we're kind of interested in here. So with the fact that we don't observe such a concurrent sustaining cause where the existence is being held into being at every moment, you know, seems to be best explained by the fact that existential inertia is true. And the second explanatory advantage is that we do not see objects randomly or instantaneously being annihilated at random. And that's best explained by the fact that it persists. You know, again, we're going back to that previous probability argument. You know, it seems it seems more fitting to explain why this occurs under existential inertia than God, who can simply will at any time that it be annihilated or something of that sort. And the third thing is that it seems to best explain how we ordinarily explain things of existence, how we explain the persistence of things in existence. So like whether it's science or the ordinary man, for example, take that banana on a table that exists there at T2. So when we try to explain it, why is that table there? We typically explain in terms of it existing yesterday, right? We say, yeah, it's there because it existed yesterday. 2, no one moved it off the table. And 3, there was nothing to destroy it. So we usually appeal to those things, but we don't make any appeal to like a sustaining cause for when we're trying to explain why the banana is there. So that seems to be more naturally fit than under existential inertia, because that's how we typically explain things. And the fourth one, and he says that explanatory advantage that he has is that, well, this best explains diachronic identity or identity in through time in comparison to like a theistic account. So a theistic account, at least especially from Phaser, at least how Joe understands Phaser as saying, is that the theistic account is where God is wholly reconstituting things from non-being at every moment. And if that's the case, it's hard to see where there's persistence there. How does that, if God's constantly recreating something new, you know, at every single moment of time, and is that really the same thing that existed prior? And it seems like that isn't the case. So it seems like existential inertia doesn't have that problem, because it's just that things have an inherent, or whatever you want to say, not metaphysically necessary tendency to persist. And the last argument I think they would give, which is pretty common, is that they would say, well, there just are no good arguments for divine conservation. It just seems to beg the question against existential inertia by assuming some other principle, by assuming there's only 2 principles of being or what have you. So that seems to be a problem. And so none of the divine conservation accounts seem to exclude existential inertia in principle, at least according to them. And so the second problem too, in addition to that, is that it seems to presuppose a controversial metaphysical account of the nature of substances. So I think Audi kind of put this best when he was kind of addressing Phaser. He says, whether hylomorphism is correct depends in part on whether things have existential inertia in the first place. So you can't argue from the way that something is, that it's hylomorphic, that has form and matter, therefore existential inertia doesn't exist, because you're assuming that hylomorphism is true. But if existential inertia is actually true, then hylomorphism proves to be false, because those aren't the only 2 principles of physical beings. And so that would be like a quick kind of summary of the arguments for existential inertia.
Yeah, that's a real good summary. Christopher, do you have anything to add to that?
That was very comprehensive. I just have one thing to add to that, right? So one reason you might think that existential inertia makes sense or is true, right, is because you have this kind of Kantian idea that existence isn't even a real property of things, right? It's not, you know, exists in our language. And now I'm kind of going forward to, you know, you might have some kind of Fregean idea about this as well. Exist in our language is just a way of talking about which universals get instantiated. And it's not a way of talking about things that actually characterizes them in any real way. And if you think that, then, right, it would make sense to think, well, yeah, I mean, there doesn't have to be any kind of conserving cause operating to keep things in existence from moment to moment, because that's just not a real, that things continue to exist, like the fact that they exist at all in the first place, is not a real feature or property of these things, right? It doesn't add anything real to a thing to say that it exists. So if you have that kind of Kantian idea, right, that existence is not a real property or not even a predicate, or the Fregean idea, right, that existence is not a first order predicate about things themselves, then you might be deeply sympathetic to existential inertia for that reason, right? That there's nothing that has to be done to a thing to make it continue existing, because it's continuing to exist and is just a ongoing, it's just a continuation of what is already something that doesn't pick out any real feature or property in the thing.
Yeah,
of course, I should.
Okay.
Yeah, of course, I should add to that. This starts to get into why this is such a hard issue to grapple with, and why it gets into so many other intersects with so many other controversial issues. Because, of course, Aristotle and Aquinas are going to have lots of disagreements with people like Kant and Frege over all kinds of things that lead them in this particular direction. There is some good work out there, right, on the Thomistic versus Kantian or Fregean notion of existence. The title and authors. So Turner Nevitt at UC at the University of San Diego has a great paper, I think in the Thomist, I'm not 100% sure about that, called How to Be, I think it's called How to Be an Analytic Thomist, where he gets into the Fregean versus Thomistic concept of existence, and why he thinks the Fregean concept just doesn't work. So if that's somebody's particular point of departure from the doctrine, right, is they think they have some kind of Fregean notion of existence, that might be a good resource for them to read.
Yeah, and just to kind of like piggyback off of that, I think, yeah, it's super important. What existence is, how we treat existence anyways, is going to have a foundational kind of effect on how we view existential inertia or divine conservation. Because, if EI, at least to some extent, some versions of it seem to treat existence as if it was like a locational property, in some way, like your object existed at this particular location that will continue to be at that location unless otherwise prevented by something, something kind of moves it along or destroys it. So that's kind of like one view. So something is located at X and it remains at X unless moved. So either that, or it seems to treat existence as if it was like one piece of a puzzle, like a Lego piece, and it attaches to another Lego piece, and you put them together, right? As Gavin says. So I think it's a good analogy, because I think, yeah, you don't, if that is how existence works, especially when it's attached to something like essence or something, or however you want to interpret that model of metaphysics, you're going to say, yeah, it can persist now. Now that it's been attached, now it will continue to be attached, given unless something else occurs to disturb it. Whereas the kind of like Thomist view kind of really differs on that, but I think we're going to get into that a little later. So,
yeah, Gil, did you watch my last major episode with Stephen Nimesh, or I hope I'm saying that right, and Gavin Kerr?
Well, I actually haven't yet.
Yeah,
I was planning to.
Yeah, because Stephen, also talks about how existential inertia kind of views existence as if like like it's a locational property, right? So my chair is going to stay in the porch and it's going to remain there unless someone takes the chair out of the porch, right? He used that analogy. Yeah. And then Gavin, wow. I mean, I like how, you and Christopher both talked about this, right? But, last time when I had Gavin Kerr on, he basically said, yeah, I mean, it is, to go to what Opie said, it is kind of question begging to just kind of be like, oh, well, no, existential inertia can't be true because, this is how things are composed, right? And then you forward the Aristotelian conception when that's the very thing being attacked or questioned. Right. Gavin says, just you have to hit straight into existence, which is a really abstract and kind of a difficult topic, but I think it's worth talking about. So, I mean, at this point then, the third question was going to be something about the dialectic, right? So who has the burden of proof? How exactly do we, frame the debate so that we, don't end up being question begging or, actually make progress rather than just talk past one another? Do you guys have anything to say about that, or do you just want to go straight into the objections to existential inertia?
Yeah, you want to start, Christopher?
Yeah. So as I think we've already, touched upon before, I think that question is really going to be relative to what the background metaphysics is more broadly. Right? Like questions about who has the burden of proof are always going to be relative to like, well, what facts do we take to be already established? Because, one person might have a burden of proof on a certain set of facts, but if I add a new fact to that set of evidence, then that might shift the burden of proof. So, I mean, I think it's really hard to ask the question of who has the burden of proof on no evidence at all. That's like so removed from our intuitions. But if you have, I think if you do have like a broadly Kantian or Fregean notion of existence, then I think we have the burden of proof on those facts. And one way of shifting that burden of proof would be to just show that a Kantian or Fregean metaphysics is fundamentally wrong in many ways, and an Aristotelian Thomistic one is fundamentally right about existence. And then the burden of proof would certainly shift, and it'd be on them to show that composites of essence and existence can go on existing without any ongoing sustaining activity by what is existence essentially.
Yeah, and I agree with that, I think. I think a lot of times when the existential inertia support defender sees us making arguments, they're kind of like, well, that begs the question. And the only reason why they perceive it as begging the question is because they simply don't accept the metaphysics behind it in the first place. And like, I think that's important. It's like, really what's going to end up happening in this discussions with those who support this idea, is that we're going to have to do metaphysics. Metaphysics is the best way to address existential inertia. We're going to have to talk about our notions of existence. We're going to have to justify those notions of existence. And so even according to those who defend existential inertia, they say that the data by itself, when we see that things persist in existence, that data by itself is neutral with respect to which view is correct. It seems like both of those, both divine conservation and existential inertia, can explain that. So it kind of seems to make agnosticism the default position. So that's why I gave those prior arguments that I was kind of running down a list of. That seems to put some support for existential inertia over divine conservation. And I think that it's definitely a good thing to kind of make note of, is that this data by itself, of course, is not going to lend any of you support for any of you. I think that's true, and it's rather trivially true, I think. Because if we just take data by itself, isolate it from any interpretation, all data is going to be neutral in some respect, or at least it seems that way. But often that's not how it's often the case. Like oftentimes the data is actually interpreted. It's actually interpreted with, say, our common sense beliefs or something like that. And so we have to kind of like, see what background knowledge we're invoking, and then kind of like work from there. Because I think at the end of the day, we're gonna both have to do metaphysics, and we're both gonna have to give arguments against each other. So I don't think it does to simply say, oh, you're begging for the existential inertia anyways, to say, oh, you're simply begging a question against our view, because you have to engage on metaphysics too, as we engage yours. And so I think there has to be like a back and forth there.
Yeah, let me just add to that. Right? So like, accusations of begging the question are just going to be super easy to make in this. And when I say accusations of begging the question here, I mean like in the loose, informal sense, where you're taken to presume things that your opponent could easily deny, as opposed to the strict sense in which you're actually presupposing the conclusion and a premise. They're going to be really, the loose, informal accusation of begging the question is going to be really easy to make in this, simply because this question stands upon so many other prior metaphysical conclusions for people like Aquinas, and other Aristotelians, I think, as well. So for those, I guess for those of you who are watching this video who find things that Gil or I say to be implausible because it assumes a lot of background metaphysics that you're not on board with, what I'd say about that is like there's not much to be done about it, unless we want to make this video like 30 hours long and we build everything up from the ground. We're going to have to what we're trying to do here is articulate what the Thomist approach broadly is. We're going to have to assume some background, Thomist material. And, if you're not on board with that, you have to go back and look at some of the videos, I think, right, that Swan, you have done on more fundamental matters in Thomist metaphysics, or do your own reading on this issue to see whether you can come to agree with the more fundamental Thomistic principles at work. One way of seeing just how involved this question is to look at Thomas's response in Article 1 of Question 5 in his De Potentia, Disputed Questions on the Power of God, where he asked the question, are things preserved in their being by God? And the response is, even by Thomistic standards, very complicated and presupposes a lot of other material that, you'd have to go read his commentary on the metaphysics and De Ante et Essentia and lots of his other works to fully understand what he's saying there. Even for me, as a well-read Thomist, I guess at this point, it's not easy to understand. It presupposes a lot of background material that you really have to grasp.
Yeah, I think that's important because I think a lot of times people don't want to do the work when it comes to understanding Thomism. And I think they just kind of want to see a superficial, like, okay, give me the gist of it. Give me the gist of it. And, oh yeah, that's obviously false. That's stupid. Like, no one can accept that. So then it's like, well, we're not going to study this anymore because you've already predetermined now, given a superficial glance of Thomism, that it's false. And I think that's what I've noticed a lot. And that's kind of something I've commented on about Thomism in general, is that's very difficult because it's such an interconnected system. I think it's a beautiful system. It's beautiful because it makes sense of each other. It's like a domino effect. I think the metaphysics makes sense of the ethics, for example, rather than just like a smorgasbord approach that we seem to have in modern philosophy. I think they're kind of used to having, okay, I like this idea. Let's just jumble them together. I think that's not a buffet. It's like, well, you have a course, you have a line of principles to follow, and they apply, and they follow through a certain course of line of reasoning. And it follows very beautifully, if you understand the system, but if people don't want to understand it. And so like when I went to school, I noticed this all the time, where it's a Cal State LA and all these different other professors, they would simply say, I don't understand, like, yeah, Thomism, what is that? What is hylomorphism? They seem like, that's just crazy nonsense. Like, do you understand what hylomorphism is then? Because they say it's nonsense. I'm like, okay, do you understand what it is? Like, no, I don't. I'm like, well, you don't really know anything about it. You're not even qualified to say that it's nonsense. So I think a lot of times in this discussion, I think it's helpful to keep in mind, if you want to be charitable, we got to be able to really delve deep into each other's views. We have to be willing to read each other charitably and understandably. And I think that requires a lot of work, but it's worth the effort.
Yeah. Let me just, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah. One of the, gaps between, say, a Thomistic philosophy and contemporary analytic philosophy is that contemporary analytic philosophers, for the most part, do not really attempt to even do what Aquinas did, which is to have a comprehensive synthetic view of all philosophy, right? To try to answer every question in a coherent way. Contemporary analytic philosophy is really good at rigor, but it's really bad at having a comprehensive synthetic view of reality. It likes to pick certain arguments and just null on them forever, which is that's a helpful thing to do sometimes. But it comes often at the price, that often comes at the cost of philosophers spending their entire career, just hammering away at a single argument instead of building a broad basis of work on which a whole worldview could be founded. The last people to really even try to do something like that are people like Leibniz, arguably Hegel, but Hegel, is weird. Leibniz would probably be the person I would say who's like tried to do that in a real way, and in a way that approaches something worthy of consideration. And people like Aristotle and Aquinas fit into that category as well, right? They're not just famous because they were so good at philosophy or so good at arguments. they're also famous because they had something to say about everything. And that's, yeah, I mean, that is something worth trying to do.
Yeah.
But it's hard. It requires patience and willingness to consider an argument for more time than it takes to read the premises and the conclusion, to really delve into the background theory. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick that, yeah, metaphysics is often a very slow and careful process. And if you don't have like the patience or the humility to really go through it, then the conversation is just not going to go anywhere. And then Gil, I mean, you know, the experience that you had where people would claim to say that hylomorphism was stupid, and then you would ask them to define it, they had no idea, right? Like,
Yeah.
I remember one time I had a professor in class who was like, yeah, the scholastics were anti-science, anti-intellectuals, you know? And then after class, I was like, hey, professor, and I tried to introduce like the basic concepts of Thomistic metaphysics to him. And then he was like, I have no idea what any of those words mean that you just said. And I was like, wait a minute. Okay, so if you're going to say this is stupid, then like, these are like the basic concepts. Anyway, so let's go to like the main question that we have, right? Which is the objections that you can raise to existential inertia. Maybe, I don't know who I want to go first. Maybe I have to flip a coin, right? And do probability. No,
I'll yield to Gil.
All right, sure. Gil, go first, and then Christopher piggyback.
Yeah.
Okay. So two different ways I could probably start with this. I can give like the prima facie, like initial glance case against existential inertia, where it's just like, I'm starting with common sense. And it seems like under common sense, there's some presumption at least for a divine conservation or some type of conservation of concurrent existence. So one of the analogies I would give in this, it's a rough analogy, but it's an analogy that I think kind of brings out the point, which is like, suppose I imagined a character and his name was Exerius, and he ruled 12 kingdoms on a black throne. He was capable of spitting fire, and he could take on Swan the Avatar, you know? He's a pretty awesome guy. And so I have this character in my head, Exerius, who exists in some loose sense, in fact, right? Because he exists now in my imagination. He didn't exist prior. So there's certain existence here. Now, suppose then I stopped imagining Exerius. Now, what would happen? Well, obviously, he would not continue. He would cease to exist. He wouldn't continue to exist, right? There's a certain concurrent, like, sustaining causality going on there in which I'm imagining him, and my imagining him is therefore bringing him into being. So I think that's much more like how we then envision like existence itself, like we're talking about existence itself, especially for the Thomists. We're envisioning existence in that similar way, an analogous way to that, where you're kind of sustaining it into existence. It doesn't have existential inertia once you've brought it into existence. So it would be absurd to say, well, Exerius, yes, you brought Exerius into existence. Now he has this metaphysically necessary primitive fact that he continues into existence, right? Now, of course, existential inertia is not going to say, well, that's not a fundamental entity. I'm only talking about fundamental entities. Now, I know that they're going to say that, but nonetheless, like we're trying to see, like, this is how existence is typically understood under Thomism, and that's particular sense, rather than say Legos being attached or something. So that's the central point here. Now, we can go even further in this and saying that, well, I'm imagining Exerius, so my intentional act, is giving actuality to Exerius at this very moment, but it's also something else in addition to that. So I have the imaginative faculty. So that imaginative faculty is also in existence. So my intentional act is bringing it to existence in my imagination, right? So that imaginative faculty has to be there. So the imaginative faculty is also a concurrent sustaining cause, right? We couldn't have Exerius in existence without that concurrent sustaining cause. In addition to, we have that imaginative faculty is upheld by a neurological structure. And that neurological structure is held into being by like a chemical structure, and in turn by an atomic structure, and then in turn by a particle structure and quantum structure, what have you. It goes down into that list there, and it seems to be like there is in fact a concurrent sustaining cause, contrary to what was initially claimed, that we don't observe concurrent sustaining causes. I think we do. I think it's evident that we do. And if you can say that not being able to observe concurrent sustaining causes evidence for existential inertia, then we can just simply go back and say, well, conversely then, if we do observe, we observe concurrent sustaining causes, and that would be evidence for, divine conservation. So I think this kind of gives like an initial case here, because it seems like there is an explanation there. There's an explanation for why it exists. And we see that even in natural substances. In fact, all natural substances, I would say, seem to have this. Like when we talk about water, why is water actually what it is? We're going to have to make reference to the fact that it is oxygen and hydrogen, right? It's made up of those things. So it would be kind of fair to say that in some way, like water is made up of hydrogen and oxygen. So the hydrogen and oxygen exist in water in some way. So that explains why it's here and now. There's a certain kind of concurrent sustaining cause, you can say, not in an efficient kind of order. We're not talking about efficient causality, because under Aristotelian Thomism, we have different kinds of causality, that form of causality. So, obviously Thomas is going to say, yeah, it exists virtually in water, but that doesn't necessarily deny that it's a concurrent sustaining cause, as Joe wants to say in his paper. I think it really is. It does have a kind of causal factor. It sustains water as it is in some way, and so it's very clear to me that things in existence seem to have that kind of explanation where we see in the natural order of things. And if it seems to have that kind of explanation, through everything and through different layers of reality, then why not the most fundamental layer of reality as well? Because we're talking about contingent things, right? We're not simply saying that, we're not simply talking about like necessary entity like God or something. We're talking about very contingent things that we can conceive can begin to exist. So working off of this then, usually the existential inertia, one who defends it, is going to grant that a thing's contingent nature is something that stands in the need of explanation, right? They're going to typically grant that because of the principle of sufficient reason. So if that's true, then it's also true that a thing's contingent nature remains contingent even after it begins to exist. So it's not as if it doesn't need any explanation now, just simply because something brought into existence. It seems to be the case that it continues to need an explanation. So if a contingent thing requires an explanation of its existence in virtue of being contingent, then it should still require such an explanation even after being brought into existence. So why does a contingent thing persist in existence? So at the very least, though, we can say that the presumption is in favor of divine conservation, because the thesis already provides an explanation. Whereas existential inertia, at least the thesis by itself, simply seems to provide a descriptive answer, a just because kind of answer. And I think that's unsatisfactory. Now, of course, the one who defends it is going to say, well, it's not just because. We do have metaphysical accounts. Yeah, sure. I do think those metaphysical accounts ultimately fail and reduce to something like a just because kind of answer. But nevertheless, I think that this seems to gives a natural presumption in favor of divine conservation. And so if we concede that way, I think that's a good starting point then, using common sense, at least, as a common sense as a starting point, to see that divine conservation seems to have something in favor of it.
I'm sure you have other arguments, Gil, that you want to talk about, but can I just add that one? So one thing you might have, one objection that the proponent of existential inertia might have to that analogy, right, going all the way back to the beginning, was that here's the difference between imagination and like things that exist in the world, right? You might think things in your imagination depend on, your imaginative activity, whereas things out there in the world do not depend on any, external concurrent sustaining cause, because those things are out there and are physical existing things, right? And things in your imagination are not. But it occurred to me as I was thinking of that objection is going to fail for the following reason, namely that when we're talking about creation, God's bringing things into being in the first place. He does not presuppose the matter in which these physical things are going to exist. He has to give that to them too, right? It's the whole being of the substance that has to be created by God. And so when it comes to the objection that, well, these things subsist in matter external to the mind, is not going to be sufficient, because when we're talking about the creative act, we're talking about an act that doesn't presuppose that matter in the way that, the difference between imagination and knowledge does for us. In that, like, I receive knowledge from the external world, but my imagination is free to think of things that don't exist. So there is a difference there between imagination and things that exist in the world. But God doesn't create in a way that makes physical things come to subsist in pre-existent matter. So I think the analogy between imagination and creation probably is a lot closer than one would initially think once one gets a correct account of creation. And as you were speaking, I mentioned this before, but I want to, as you were speaking, it just became more and more evident to me how important this is. I sent to you, Swan, by the chat box, a link to the academia copy of Turner Nevitt's How to Be an Analytic Existential Thomist, which is, so for those, because I've just become more and more convinced this is like an important piece of background reading for those of you, those who are watching the video now and who take a more analytic approach to questions about existence. Turner is a very good analytic Thomist. He's has one foot solidly in both the analytic and Thomistic philosophy camps, and so he's a great translator, if you will. So for those watching who are just like, I just don't understand this Thomistic talk about existence, definitely recommend that paper. I heard him actually present it in Athens, actually, and he did an excellent job. I thought it was an amazing paper. Highly recommend it. Anyway, Gil, sorry to interrupt.
You're good.
Sure, you have other you have other arguments you want to present. So go ahead.
Yeah. So just important clarification, because I know they're going to probably, maybe some of them might flip out. Oh, that's a stupid analogy. But of course, like I said, it's a rough analogy, and it's only meant to like kind of give a rough estimation of how we view existence, in terms of like bringing about an understanding there. But also, I think in terms of like it's showing that there is a certain concurrent causes, even at the real like level of physical stuff, not just at the imaginative level, where you might say that that's an accidental thing, that's an accidental feature of us, right? Having that particular imagination of Xeria. So nonetheless, you still go trickle down and you still talk about the water substance. And I think that's still a serious issue. So of course, the existential inertia is going to deny this, like Joe does. They're going to make some metaphysical claim about the nature of such substances. They're going to appeal to something about causality to dismiss the claim that there are concurrent sustaining causes. Although Joe himself also says that, well, I could concede that there are concurrent sustaining causes for non-fundamental entities, but for fundamental entities, there's not. So he, and under his view, to be fair to him, he can accept this to some extent. But nonetheless, it just seems to me like, well, why stop there? Why stop at just a fundamental level of entities? Why not explain that as well? Because they seem to be explicable, and it seems like they're contingent, given what we know about the nature of such things. So it seems like the presumption is in favor of giving an explanation, which divine conservation does provide. So that's the initial glance case I would provide against it. Now, I'm not sure which. Yeah.
And real quick, this kind of reminds me of when Fazer debated Oppie on capturing Christianity. And there was a point where Fazer was kind of like, it sounds like, like your naturalism is basically, or like the simples of Oppie's theory, it almost just sounds like my classical theism, except I just have one like sustaining reality, but you have like multiple things that are fundamental, right? So for instance, like, I think the point that Christopher raised about, well, matter is not, a given, right? It's something that God also brought into existence as well, at least on our picture, right? Like, could an existential inertia advocate say, well, matter's fundamental, right? Or something like that. So then it's like divine conservation, but instead it's material conservation. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point, Swan. I mean, I think the debate is going to start to look a lot like this question about whether there could only be one actus purus, right? Whether you can get the unicity of God, the uniqueness of God from the demonstration of actus purus. And the way in which I think it's going to be analogous is because it's going to then become a debate about whether what's going to be the nature of the ultimate sustaining cause or causes, and ultimately a question, right, about whether the ultimate sustaining cause or causes, if you think there are multiple ones, have to be things in which essence and existence are not distinct. I think that's just another way of, it's not really a way of evading or defeating the arguments for the doctrine of divine conservation as much as it is a way of recasting the argument about, instead of being an argument about whether there is any such conserving cause, it becomes an argument about what the nature of the conserving cause is.
And real quick too, I mean, Gil mentioned, I think it was Opie's argument or even Joe's argument, right? Like about positing less causal entities or whatever, right? Like this is their picture is simpler, right? But if we frame the debate in that light, then if we, as divine conservationists, we just posit one fundamental supreme reality that sustains everything, that seems to be simpler than, Opie's simples, maybe. I don't know. I know that Joe's going to write a blog post about this, so I'm careful about what I'm going to say. But you guys keep on going.
I mean, let me, I saw that comment too, Swan. I just want to note, like, it's a lot easier to write blog posts than it is to try to do this stuff in real time on video. So hopefully Joe will have mercy on us in that respect, keeping in mind that we're speaking extemporaneously.
Yeah, it's easy to misphrase things. So
I had this experience all the time. Like I'm talking and I'm like, I know this isn't quite correct, but I'm too far into the sentence to start to try to rephrase things now, so I'm just going to let it go.
Yeah, same. Well, I don't know which one we want to do next, because I feel like we can get to the central argument, which is, of course, since something that exists, like essence and existence, or you want to respond to the arguments for inertia. I'm not sure which ones you guys think we should start with.
I think, so there's something I want to do that I forgot to do earlier.
Okay.
Back when we were steel manning arguments for existential inertia, in the spirit of steel manning, I would like to, I guess, note what I consider to be a really bad mischaracterization of the argument for, or just the view of divine conservation that I think appears in Joe's paper. You brought it up already, Gil, at one point. It appears in his section on diachronic identity. And he's arguing there that the doctrine of divine conservation poses a problem, or what he calls TST, poses a problem for theory of for our theory of diachronic identity, because he analogizes the divine conservation to the destruction of a painting and creation of a qualitatively identical but token distinct painting that has been made spatiotemporally continuous with the destroyed painting, and ask the question of whether that would be sufficient to make the new painting identical with the old one. Everybody more or less agrees that it would not be sufficient. And so it's not clear that divine conservation, he argues, it's not clear that divine conservation is therefore sufficient to maintain diachronic identity for the thing that is conserved. But I think this is, not just wrong, but really wrong. Precisely because it's the doctrine of divine conservation, not the doctrine of divine continuous recreation. Right. So what we're suggesting is not that God recreates creatures in every moment that they exist, destroying the ones from previous moments and creating brand new ones for this moment, and then again in the next moment. But that he is conserving them across moments from time to time. He's not annihilating creatures. In fact, it's traditionally been an article of faith on Christianity that God never has and never will annihilate any creature, or if not an article of faith, a probable theological opinion at least. And so this whole, I would want to dissuade anyone from thinking that this is a good analogy for the doctrine. It's not, right. It's a view on which the creature is conserved, not continuously recreated. That would be a really strange and implausible view that would raise serious problems for diachronic identity, devastating, conclusive problems for diachronic identity, I think. I don't disagree there, but I disagree that that is an adequate analogy to the doctrine in any way.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I was like really puzzled too, because I studied under Phaser and studying it, and I never seen Phaser ever claim that things are constantly recreated. There's nowhere in his literature. So I was trying to look for like a footnote, but I wasn't able to see one, at least in a manuscript that I saw, the draft version, I suppose. But maybe he has some quote that Phaser says this, but I'm pretty sure it's a deep misunderstanding, because I definitely don't think Phaser would ever hold to that. That seems to be against the Catholic dogma right there. So I don't, it doesn't make sense to me. So, but yeah, I think this, what, or go on, go ahead.
Yeah, so on page, so just to get more exact about this, page 15 of Joe's article, right, he says, the first complete paragraph, but now consider Phaser's TST as an account of persistence. Prima facie, Phaser's account is almost identical to the scenario involving the painting. On Phaser's account, God does not act on a previously existent concrete object to conserve it in existence, preserving its original constituents. Instead, God wholly reconstitutes concrete objects from utter non-being at each and every moment. For Phaser, at each moment, non-God concrete objects transition from potency to act with respect to their very existence, and at each moment, God is the ultimate actualizer of such transitions. I don't know where he got that from. That is not, it's just not the view.
It's
at all.
It's so obviously wrong that I'm like, I think he must have been reading some other book if that's the case, because that's why I quoted Aquinas at the very beginning. Because he got the tendency to persist.
Yeah, and I mean, there might be some place in Phaser that he's getting that from. I wouldn't know where it is. But if in fact Phaser has written something that makes that, or of which that is a reasonable interpretation, then Phaser is wrong.
Right. Definitely. Definitely. Clearly.
And for someone who might have a question then about, okay, then what is the divine conservationist view of the consistency or persistence of identity, let's say, through time? Like, if just to help them out, what would you guys say, or how would you explain it?
Want to take that one, Chris?
Oh yeah, sure. So I mean, I think you could just say, it is God acting on the previously existent concrete object, right? To continually actualize its existence. So go back, and this is kind of presupposing an argument that I'm going to get into in just a moment when we start talking about arguments for start talking further about arguments for the doctrine of divine conservation. But suppose for a moment that it is, as I've suggested, a per se causal series, right? And then the proper analogy for the divine conservation is like the hand pushing the stick, pushing the stone, or the rock. When I push the stick, I'm not stopping and starting the motion at every moment that the stick is moving. Rather, there's one continuous motion by which I push the stick, and that motion continues as long as I continue to push the stick. It is true that I could stop pushing the stick and start a brand new motion. I could do that, and God could annihilate us and reconstitute creatures qualitatively identical to us, and they would be distinct from us. They would be distinct from us. But that's not the suggestion, right? The suggestion is that it's like me pushing the stick, pushing the rock. It's all the same motion from moment to moment, just like my existence as conserved by God is the same existence from moment to moment. In an analogous way.
All right, I think that's a good explanation, because how I'm seeing this, it just puzzles me that he thinks this is like objection, but I think he's viewing of time almost as almost discrete points or something. Because in order to think this, you have to think like God pushes something. He like for a second he stops, and all of a sudden he runs and then tries to or does
Yeah,
something. There's a moment in which it doesn't exist, so he stops
yeah.
his
This
conferring
comes
existence
back
to
to
it.
this comes back to my misgivings about talk of each and every moment in the doctrine, because
Yep.
it starts to sound like these each and every moments are something you can count, something you
Mm-hmm.
can, something that exists, rather than just our potentials in
Yep.
something that is moving,
Yep.
something that's being moved. And this is where, like I said, it goes back to like you have to really have read, Aristotle and know Aristotle, right? The in Aristotle, right, in something that is moving, there are no actually existent instance of which that motion is built up, right? That leads to all kinds of weird paradoxes about time and change.
Yep.
Rather, right, the moments, each and every moment, so to speak, right, only exists as a potential, right, as somewhere where the motion could stop. And if it did, then that would be it would become an actual moment, something where a motion, the beginning or end of some motion. Um, but it's not, it's the motion that is ontologically prior here, right, to the
Right.
moment.
Yep.
And right, like I said, otherwise you run into really nasty paradoxes about time and change, and about how things could change if time were constituted of instantaneous moments.
Yep.
Um, yeah, so right, it's best analogized to God is continuously uh, moving me, so in a way, right, moving my essence, and then so moving my essence uh, makes me exist, from potentiality to actuality at every moment at every moment, yeah, right,
Yep.
continuously through time, um, in such a way that you could speak mentally of there being moments there, but uh, those moments exist only potentially, right? And what's really happening is there's one continuous fluid motion, uh,
Yep.
of which in which the moments exist only potentially.
I think that's
Yeah,
really good because the analogy I was thinking, sorry to interrupt you, but the analogy
no,
I
you're
was
good.
thinking was like a train, on the track. I'm constantly, continuously pushing that train. And so it's a continuous motion. It's not as if like you can videotape it and then split it into discrete parts and analyze
Yeah,
it. You can do that potentially, like you were saying, but like generally speaking, we're moving a being as some kind of object and being. So God is actualizing that
yeah.
being in a continuous way. So
Yeah,
I
so
think that's
and
helpful.
there may be a issue here about the correct conceptualization of actualization as well,
Right.
because actualization is not something that happens instantaneously, at least not all the time.
Yep.
Right, motion is right, the actualization of something in potential insofar as it's in potential. So when we're like, to take the stick analogy again, right? When I'm moving the stick, what's going on is not that I am, at every moment that I'm moving the stick, I'm I'm actualizing the stick's potential to be in the next region of space time, and I'm just continuing to do that at each moment that I'm moving the stick. Rather, right, I am uh, over time actualizing the stick's potential to be in the place where it's next going to come to rest.
Right.
And there's a really big difference between those two things, right?
Yeah.
So analogizing that with me, right? It's not a matter of God's continuously um, recreating me in every moment that I exist, taking me from non-existence to existence in every moment, but rather of God continuously. Um, well, it's a little bit complicated for me because I, in the long run, don't ever stop existing. So let's take a simpler creature, talk about a dog that has a definite beginning and end of its existence, right? God is by one continuous motion bringing that dog into being, preserving it in being, throughout its life, and then it comes to rest again in some sense, right? When it stops existing. And that's one fluid, continuous motion of the dog, so to speak. It's one fluid, continuous actualization of the dog.
Yeah, and just for the sake of clarity, so it seems like we've moved on from objections to existential inertia to just refining or defining rather like a divine conservation in time and so forth.
Sorry.
No, I mean, it's okay. So I mean, we can continue going on this path. I don't mind, but like, I also do want to like get to some direct objections to existential inertia. Real quick, Christopher, or I don't know, this is not a quick question, but does any of this hinge on the theory of time that you accept, or can we just avoid that whole issue and just say, all right, I think these are pretty intuitive no matter what camp you're in, you know, like how much does that matter?
Good. Well, that's actually a good point of transition to the positive arguments I want to give against existential inertia. Because I have one that's, I think there are certain arguments you could give that definitely would depend on what the correct theory of time ends up being. And that makes things way more complicated because there's so many options, and that is such an area of hotly contested area within contemporary analytic philosophy that we'd be better off really just having the first order debate about which theory of time is correct. But I think there's one argument that Aquinas gives that I don't think depends on the right theory of time. And then I have another broadly analytic argument of my own construction that I think will work against existential inertia, at least if you hold two of the most popular views of what time, of how time works and how persistence works. Right. So we should, it would be remiss of us to not address the actual argument that Aquinas gives against the existential inertia. And I'll just remind the audience again, of course, right, that he's presupposing a bunch of stuff that he takes himself to have demonstrated elsewhere when he gives this. We really are, building upon that here. But the argument that I'm discussing comes from, let me make sure I'm getting this right? This is from the Summa Prima Pars, question 104, article 1, whether creatures need to be kept in existence by God. Directly the question that we're addressing here. So of course, he's already had a lot of things to say about God's nature and activity, creation, all those things. That's all going to get presupposed here. But I want to try to boil down the essentials of the argument as much as I can, and just try to get at what I think is the real issue here. So there he has a lot to say about the difference between causing something to become and causing something to be. But I think the core of the argument is really, and this is where his Neoplatonism shines through, right? He relies upon a doctrine of participation here, right? So my gloss on his argument, right, is whatever is F by participation depends on every moment for its Fness on what is F essentially, right? So supposing that there was a Platonic form of whiteness, for example, I don't think there is, but suppose that there was, right, it would be clear that everything that participates, every concrete reality here below that participates in whiteness by being white, right, depends for its whiteness at every moment on what is white essentially, right? The Platonic form of whiteness is white essentially, not merely by participation. And it's clear that it depends at every moment on that, because if the Platonic form of whiteness, right, were to cease to exist, if you will, then clearly nothing could continue to be white, because to be white on this theory at least, right, just is to participate in the Platonic form of whiteness, right? That's what the theory of participation is supposed to be. It's a theory of how things come to have, what constitutes things having the properties or attributes that they have, right? And so if participation in whiteness constitutes a concrete objects being white, then it's clear that it depends on that form at every moment that it exists, because it's a constitutive relation, right? And constitutive relations are by their nature the kind of relations that have to obtain at every moment if the relata are, if the relation's going to continue to ground the property possession of the relatum, right? So we first premise, right, whatever is F by participation depends on every moment on what is F essentially. Premise 2, beings in which existence and essence are distinct are beings by participation. Now I'll note here, right, this is one of the parts where we're relying upon things that Aquinas takes himself to have shown before, right, that in creatures, essence and existence are distinct. And, listeners who disagree with that should go read Aquinas' De Ante et Essentia, or lots of the good stuff that Phaser has had to say about this by way of exposition of Aquinas. But, right, assuming that you're with us on that, right, then my premise 2, right, is that beings in which existence and essence are distinct are beings by participation. And from that, it follows, right, that beings in which essence and existence are distinct depend at every moment on what is being essentially. Right? I'll just repeat that in case people are are trying to write this down or whatever. Beings in which essence and existence are distinct depend on every moment on what is being essentially. Now, what is being essentially? Well, again, right, if you read the De Ante et Essentia or any of Aquinas's metaphysics, right, it's very clear he takes himself to have demonstrated that God is what is being essentially, and God alone, because in God alone is there no distinction between essence and existence. So this is a kind of participation argument, right, that beings in which essence and existence are distinct depend at every moment on the one being in which essence and existence are not distinct, because their very being, their existence, is just participation in what is being essentially. I have another argument, but maybe Gil wants to say something to supplement that.
No, I think that's really good. That's pretty similar to kind of what I was actually going to argue about. I think what it really boils down to is going to be existence and essence there, that distinction. And I think it's fairly straightforward in case you're not really quite familiar with that. Just take the essence of something. Like say you knew everything that could possibly be about the essence of a hamster. You knew all its sleep patterns, everything that could be that derives from that essence, and also the essence itself. The property, its properties. So you can know everything about what there is to be a hamster, and yet still not know that it exists. So the essence concerns what a thing is, and existence concerns that a thing is, right? It's the essence to be. And so I think that's a really important thing, because I think it's really intuitive. I think if you really kind of examine the concepts of it, like you can know everything there is about any contingent thing, and that would be that it has a certain essence, and so its essence will be distinct from its existence. And so I think this analysis of essence and existence is actually super helpful, because in analytic philosophy, it's typically kind of grounded in terms of possible world semantics. And I think it's a super, the big difference between them is that they're going to try to say, well, if it exists in all possible worlds, then it's necessary. If it exists in some worlds, but not in other worlds, then it can fail to exist, right? We think of that as contingency. But I think that just fails to provide a kind of ontology, like some grounding of what makes a thing contingent. You're simply saying conditions, like maybe logical conditions of its contingency, given certain a state of affairs that exist or not in some world, but you're not really giving it ontological grounding of where that's coming from. That's what I love about Aquinas, is that he's doing that. He's giving a grounding of contingency. He's giving a grounding of necessity. And necessity being here is being understood as God's essence being identical to his existence, right? And so that seems to make a lot of sense. And I think the analytic position seems to kind of just take it for granted. So I think it's like it's metaphysically bankrupt in a way, because it doesn't have a way of grounding that. and you're just talking about contingent things in this conditional sense or what have you, and it's saying exists in this particular world and always exists in all these other worlds. But I think that's just to put the cart before the horse, right? We need to really understand what a thing is before we can understand what a thing is in some other possible world. And so I think that's a really important thing when we're building this, to see the plausibility of the essence existence distinction here. So that would be something I'd add to that, because that's definitely an argument that would go to, like, Gavin was making a similar sort of argument too when he was talking to Joe. And the way I formulated it, but I think yours is definitely superior in this, in that it kind of emphasizes the fact of participation. And I think that's super important, because the way I framed it, and this is how I kind of like constructed it, just to kind of give you a rundown here. It's like, premise one is that whatever has existence at any moment has it in virtue of its essence or in virtue of an external sustaining cause. Two, in contingent things where essence and existence are distinct, existence cannot be had in virtue of its essence. So therefore, premise three, therefore all contingent things must have existence in virtue of an external sustaining cause, in which we understand to be being itself, right? If we have an analysis of that. So I think that this seems to be pretty plausible. It seems to be a really damning kind of objection against existential inertia, because it seems to treat, again, existence as if it's locational, as if it's some kind of like property, like redness that adheres in some object, or like some kind of Lego piece that you put together. And for the Thomas, that's simply an incorrect way to think about existence. Existence is a fundamental principle of things. Existence and essence aren't distinct things that we conjoin. We have this essence here, and then we have existence here, and we just conjoin them. Rather, it's more of a composition. It's a constitutive principle of act and potency. So existence then is a principle by which something exists, but it still requires a cause in order to be present in a thing, right? And that's the participation where we're going here. So existence would be the act of all acts under a Thomistic view. So without that, without existence, that act of all acts, there would be nothing. We wouldn't have essence. So essence exists precisely because it subsists in the essay that it has.
And if I could interject real quick.
Yeah.
If I could interject real quick. Like I remember, once again, going back to the Stephen Nimesh and Gavin Kerr dialogue, like I think, I forgot who mentioned it specifically. One of them did, but they talked about how us Thomists, we have a very kind of thick conception of essence, or excuse me, existence, while like analytics tend to have a very kind of thin conception of existence. So, like you talked about, like Gil, like logical conditions and other things and so forth, right? But that doesn't really get at the heart of what we're exactly talking about, right? So for someone who comes from an analytic background, I could see maybe why like existential inertia just seems like the go-to option, or it just seems to make sense to them, right? But I think if you're really going to enter a debate with the Thomistic framework, you have to be able to not only use the analytic framework, if that's where you're coming from, but also defend it kind of from the outside. So you have to, you have to do something more kind of self-reflective in that sense, right? I don't know what you guys think about that, but I'm loving what's been said so far. So
I just want to add something to the argument, which is that it will in fact be consistent with, I think, at least some of the accounts that Joe gives in his article. So these aren't competing accounts. So for example, the account that I have in mind from Joe's paper is the first account where he says for a concrete object O and times t minus 1 and t, the existence of O at t is explained by the conjunction of the existence of O at t minus 1 and the absence of any sufficiently causally destructive factors acting at O minus t minus 1, O at t minus 1 and through t. It's lots of, you got to go read the article. It's lots of, it's very analytic, jargony way, in a good way. It's good to have precision. But his basic point there, right, is that in the absence of any causally destructive factors, what explains something's existence now is just its having existed at the prior moment. And let's say that that's true, right? Still, that would not be sufficient, I think, to establish existential inertia. I think that's one of the problems with Joe's paper, as I read it, is that he's giving explanations that don't go, explanations that might be successful at some level of why things persist across time, but that don't address whether those facts themselves are explained by something like God, right? So if you thought that an account like that were true, right, that still wouldn't explain why O has T at any moment that it does, right? If O has T by, or sorry, not T. If O has existence by participation, that would not explain why O has existence at any time that it does. It may be true that at some level, the existence of O at this moment is explained by its existence at the previous moment or previous moments, as the case may be. But it would still be true that O depends for its existence as a being that exists by participation on what is existence, essentially the same way as I might say, my walls are white, and their being white at this moment depends, is explained by their having been white at the moment before and my having not painted them, or their color otherwise not being changed by any external factors in the time between the last moment and now. That's fine. That's one explanation at a certain level of why they're white now. But we're after a deeper explanation here, right? We're after an explanation of what makes them white at any moment that they are white, regardless of whether that whiteness was somehow inherited from previous moments. And if something like Platonism were true, again, I'm just using that example. I don't think it is for things other than existence or other divine attributes. But if something like Platonism were true about whiteness, then and things were white by participation in whiteness, then it even though my walls at some level, even though at some level it's true that my walls are white now because they were white at the moment prior and nothing has changed their color, it would also be true that they're white now because they participate in the form of whiteness. And that's also the reason that they were white at the moment before and every other moment at which they've existed. So this isn't to say that Joe's first account, which I think is the most promising of the three accounts he discusses there, says anything false. It's not clear to me that it does. But just that it's not the ultimate explanation. And if you accept the theory of participation, where beings in which essence and existence are distinct are beings by participation, then I think you can start to see how it obviously is not the most fundamental explanation for why things exist at every moment that they do.
Yeah, just to kind of work off of that too, I think the reason why I don't think it comes across as false to us, especially as compatible, is just simply because Joe is not actually providing an ontology when he's giving that metaphysical account. He calls it a metaphysical account, but I don't see an ontology there because, at this point, he's just simply stating in terms of earlier, later than relations, in some sense, have some kind of explanation for why it persists, that so far it's causing that the earlier point in time is causing the later point in time in some way. But that's, for me, it's just a description of a state of affairs because you're just saying you're not addressing what in virtue of what is it persisting? What in virtue of what is existence persisting? It's only that given certain conditions, that you exist at T1 and then you also exist at T2 or something, you come to exist at T2, you're not impeded and yet you exist immediately prior. It suffices to explain why it exists at T2. But that's like, well, that doesn't seem sufficient to me. It's just like, you don't refer to any constitutive or metaphysical principles by which this occurs, right? It's kind of like saying, like a clock will change from 4 p.m. to 4:01, like on the screen, as long as nothing impedes it from doing so, and as long as it was 4 p.m. prior. While this is perhaps interesting, of course, from like a purely logical or conditional perspective, it's kind of useless when we're trying to understand it from a physical and metaphysical perspective, right? I can still ask, but what causes the power? What power caused it to go from like 4 o'clock to 4:01? And the simple answer for the physicist is going to be like electricity, and for the simple answer for the theist is existence itself. But for the existential inertia, the defender of it, it just seems like a just because kind of answer. It's not really an answer to me. And that's why it seems compatible with our account, because we can just interject and say, oh, here, we actually do have a metaphysical kind of mechanism by which, or in virtue of which it continues to exist.
And in Joe's defense, this is an article, to give a whole background ontology would really be a book-length project.
Right.
As someone who has struggled with journal referees myself, they often pressure you in certain ways to cut details that you can't adequately defend at that length, in ways that make the article more detached from one's background theory than you'd like to see. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't expect Joe's article to have like a whole exposition of his entire ontology, but that's probably, I mean, but that is probably just a way of saying that when we're talking about something like existential inertia, to come back to this point yet again, we should probably be reading books more than articles, because it really does sit upon an ontology that requires extensive development before you give this conclusion. And if you worked all that out, then I think it does really follow rather readily, but it requires a lot of previous working out in a way that is not very amenable to an article length treatment. It's very hard to do it. It'd be very hard to do that well without having, an extensive interaction, an explanation of interaction with an explanation of the underlying ontology.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of books, Swartz is pretty good. Swartz has
there you go.
creation, conservation, and concurrence. It's pretty thick here. So it kind of like really gets to the heart of that kind of issue as well, in case you're interested in, reading something further. Really
good stuff. I was just reading Suarez the other day on just war theory, and so complicated. So complicated. But I would give another. I do want to give another example, because I think maybe this helps too. So even in per Atchison series. So think about like the father and son case again, right? It's true that I exist because my father caused me to exist, in the same way, right, that you might think O at T exists because O at T1 exists. O at T minus 1 existed. And that's true at a certain level of explanation, right? Like I exist and have the power to conceive a son myself because my father conceived me. That's perfectly true. But at a deeper level, I depend at all times, just like my father does, upon my human nature, right? As a substance, I depend upon my nature at every moment that I exist. And so does the thing that explains how I started to exist, namely my father. He depends on his human nature too. And my power to, say, conceive a son of my own, for example, depends upon my human nature and the ways in which reproduction works for me as a human being, as opposed to any other species. And that I think is analogous to the way in which, Joe's first account, at least, right, wants to explain the existence of O at T in terms of O at T minus 1 and the lack of any destructive causal factors. And that's the way in which my father explains my existence. Yes. And my ability to father a son of my own, because he caused me to exist and gave me a human nature. Let's set aside for the moment God's role in giving me a human nature. But right, my father caused me to exist and gave me a human nature, and that explains my existence and my ability to father a son of my own. But more fundamentally, the thing that he gave me, my human nature, I depend for my existence upon that thing, and my ability to father a son of my own depends on that thing, and it depends on that thing at every moment that I exist, and at every other human being's existence and power to father or mother a child depends upon at every moment that they exist upon their human nature. So that's kind of the idea that I have in mind when I'm saying that Joe's first account isn't in competition with necessarily the participation account that we're giving here.
Just add to it, I just think that, as long as he's not interpreting existence, because that's the really fundamental, crucial crux of this whole entire issue, is he's not thinking of existence as like something that's had, something that thing has, something that's attached to a property, something that adheres in it, because, you're going to say this thing at T1, this object at T1 gives its existence or something, or gives existence to object T2. He might want to say that as an efficient cause, right? He's causing, but then it's kind of weird because it goes into really weird waters there, because we're talking about like almost self-causation. It's like what you're kind of in a way causing, because if your identity, the object at T2 is identical to the object at T1, You're somehow kind of causing yourself to exist at another point in time. And that's just strange. You're like thinking of existence as something that can be given, like, here, let me give you something as something to be attached. And I think Wilhelmsen puts it pretty well when he kind of defines existence in his book, the man's knowledge of reality. Because he says this, he says, being is not a state. It is not an essence. It is not what things are. Being is a doing which is not a moving, a changing, or an operating, but simply a being. So being escapes conceptualization because concepts represent what things are in themselves. So I think this is pretty helpful, I think, in kind of like getting an idea. Existence is not what a thing has. And if you think if you think existential inertia is plausible, it's precisely because you're probably thinking of existence in those terms. And it's going to be really hard for you to kind of escape that mindset. But it's rather that it's what a thing is doing, it's existing here and now. If existence then is a continuous activity, as Chris was just mentioning, if existence does not arise from its essence, then it must come from something external to that thing in question. For a thing just is its essence, right? So if essence is distinct from its existence, and existence must come from something outside of the thing by definition, because that essence just defines what it is. So it has to come something outside. So it's something by participation, by coming, by that principle of existence, which is the act of all acts. And so I think that's a really important kind of qualification there, because I think that's where the debate is going to really lie in, I think, and which I haven't seen as much engagement with as I would like. But of course, the conversation is barely beginning, I think. We're still starting this.
This is the argument. No, yeah, I agree with, I think, and Joe mentions this at one point, I totally agree with it. There's been very little treatment of existential inertia in the literature, precisely because I think it's so downstream of so many other issues where there's fundamental disagreement. But this is the argument that I would recommend proponents of existential inertia interact with and try to defeat if they're going to argue in favor of existential inertia, because I think this is the central argument for us, and seeing where they disagree with an argument like this will help us move the discussion forward, I think.
Yeah. I wanted to kind of address too a little bit more of his, let's see, I guess the initial kind of like arguments for existential inertia, if we still have time for that. I'm not sure if I have time, but I'm not sure if you guys have time.
Yeah, I have time,
Okay.
but I assume Swan is trying to keep things short here. The only other thing I have is another argument, a non-Thomistic argument for divine conservation. Swan, I'll let you decide, what you want. Do you want Gil to give what he has, or you want me to put another argument on the table? What should we do here?
Well, the funny thing is that, you said like Swan wants to keep it short. I think we're already about to hit 2 hours, Okay. So, yeah. I mean,
that's what I mean by short.
I'm actually pretty interested in what you have to say about that, Chris, though, at the very least. So I'm willing to just not say anything and hear your argument.
No. Sure. Okay. So I should specify that like when I started this channel, I kind of wanted to be the Joe Rogan of classical theism, online classical theism, right? So I want to give you guys all the reign that you need, right? Do what you got to do. Okay. So let's hear both of the arguments. Christopher, take it away.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Right. So, and I won't have too much to say about this because this is something that, I didn't develop in too much detail. This is it's the sketch of an argument, let's say, right? Okay. But two of the most popular theories of time, together with theories of persistence, are presentist endurantism, right? On where presentism is just the view that everything that exists now. There's problems with that formulation, but it'll do okay for now. And endurantism is the theory about how things persist, where we say that at every moment that they exist, their whole self is present in every moment that they exist. So things persist by being wholly present at every moment that they exist. Another theory that is very popular, right, is what's called eternalist perdurantism, where eternalism is the theory, right, that not everything that exists now, right? There's some sense in which Julius Caesar still exists, and in which my grandchildren, if I end up having any, also exists. And it's not the same sense in which I exist right now, but there's some sense of existing in the past or existing in the future that the presentist is going to deny and the eternalist is going to accept, as the names suggest. And then perdurantism, right, is a theory of persistence on which things persist by having temporal parts, by being extended temporally in much the same way that they're extended spatially, right? So what you see on the screen before you is not Christopher, but a mere small temporal piece of Christopher. Christopher is something that began to exist almost 32 years ago and will hopefully continue to exist several decades into the future. And that whole thing, right, that whole time worm, as they are sometimes called, that whole thing is me. This is what you see now is not me, it's just a piece of me. I am the whole time worm thing, right? And that's how I persist. I persist by having parts at each time at which I persist. Okay? So these are two very popular competing views of how time works together with how persistence works. Presentist endurantism and eternalist perdurantism. If you're still confused about that, there's great articles on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy about each of those four views. So I recommend taking a look at that if my brief explanations have not been sufficient. So you might think that one of those two views is true. And what I want to say, right, is that if presentist endurantism is true, then something has to ground the existence of the creature right now. For grounding is simultaneous, and so earlier versions of the same thing will not do. And I will flag here that Joe has things to say about presentism, objections from presentism in his paper. I'm not going to, for the sake of time and simplicity, I'm going to drop trying to answer those things right now and just say, right, if presentism is true and all that exists is what exists now, then what grounds my existence right now has to be simultaneous with me. My existence now can't be explained by caused or explained by my existence at prior times, at least on certain views of presentism, right? Because all we have to do the causal or explanatory work is what's available to us now. Now, let me just flag a certain issue that Aristotelian Thomists should have a certain view of, and which often gets denied, which is that causation does indeed need to be simultaneous. I think Joe has a little bit to say about this in his paper, but this is often a point of controversy in the Thomistic metaphysics, whether causation is a synchronic or diachronic phenomenon. And here I'll just give a very brief argument that it does have to be actually synchronic. There's no such thing as causation across time except by analogy. And the argument for that, right, is if you have the Aristotelian Thomistic view of what causation is, right, causation is the actualization of a potency. Every actualization of a potency has to be actualized by something which is already actual in that respect. So you always have two pieces in causation, right? You have the agent and the patient. That's not really disagreeing for the most part with contemporary analytic philosophy. Most people think of causation that way. There's an agent and a patient. But because the agent's action just is the motion, right? When I act, that is when I act upon a patient, right? When an agent acts upon a patient, that action just is the motion that is produced. That just is the actualization of the potential. And likewise, the patient's passion is also identical to the motion. It's also just the actualization of the potential. It's looking at this actualization of the potential from two different perspectives, right? You can look at it from the agent's perspective as imparting the actuality to the patient, or from the patient's perspective as receiving the actuality from the agent. But what you're really looking at are the same thing from two different perspectives, right? And so if both the agent's action and the patient's passion are identical with the motion, then they're both simultaneous with the motion and therefore simultaneous with each other. Now, that's not to say that we don't sometimes speak of causation as something that happens, across time, right? So to come back to the father and son case, if I have a son, there's some sense in which my father is we say that my father is the cause of my son, because he's the cause of me. But really, that's just a shorthand way of saying that, my father generated me, and that was a simultaneous relation. And I generate my son one day, and that'll be a simultaneous relation. And the latter one depends on the former one in a non-causal way, that makes us say that, my father is in some sense the cause of my son. But when we're speaking strictly about causation, immediate causation, right, without any kind of intermediate things happening, then the agent's action is the motion, which is the patient's passion. They're both identical with the motion and therefore simultaneous with the motion and therefore simultaneous with each other. And so if presentist endurantism is true, and causation does have to be, and certainly grounding has to be simultaneous, there has to be some ground or cause for my existence, for every creature's existence right now. Earlier versions of myself will not do. They don't exist, and the causation or grounding has to be simultaneous. Okay. And the kind of causation or grounding that we're talking about here, right, is the immediate kind, right? We're not interested in the loose and popular sense of causation where we could talk about things diachronically causing other things in virtue of immediate causation relations, together with some other stuff. Okay. So if presentist endurantism is true, then there has to be some immediate cause or ground for my existence now, and therefore something that is causing or me to exist or grounding my existence at every moment that I exist. Likewise, if eternalist perdurantism is true, then we have a certain model of what it means for God to create, right? When God is creating, he's creating the entire space-time continuum, right? If something like eternalism is true and perdurantism is true, then God is not, he's not really acting at the Big Bang in any special way, right? He's creating the entire space-time continuum all at once, right? Because that's what exists. On eternalism, what exists is the whole space-time continuum, and things perdure, and God has to create everything that exists. So he can't wait for the future to show up to create it. He has to create it now because it exists eternally, right? And so what God creates is the whole space-time continuum. And so when God's creating, he's creating creatures, which will be time worms, right, in that eternal space-time continuum. And so part of what he's doing when he creates them is giving them definite temporal boundaries, right? He's saying, or let's put it this way. What he's doing when he's creating is determining where all the parts of everything that he created will be, right? The spatial parts, as well as the temporal parts. That's where the eternalism and perdurantism are really important here, right? So on this model, right, we can think of God's continuously sustaining activity as his having created a temporal part for me at every point where I exist. And that's what it is for me to persist through time on an eternalist perdurantism. But God created all those parts, and so he is the immediate direct cause of my persistence, because in virtue of having created all my temporal parts. So God's sustaining activity consists in having given a substance all the temporal parts it has and ordering them in the right way, because of things persisting from moment to moment depends just on it having all the temporal parts that it has in the order that it has them. So on either presentist endurantism or eternalist perdurantism, things have some sustaining cause for their existence at every moment that they exist. Hopefully that wasn't too complex.
That was really good, actually. I really like those arguments. I noticed, like, because like on discussions, like Joe's always kind of wondered how his account will work under these different models of time. And I think that in either case, it's really powerful to show that in either model of time, you do still have to account for the existence under presentism or eternalism. So I really like that. It's a really good argument.
So it's worth noting that I haven't covered all the possible combinations here, right? So you could be an eternalist endurantist. You could hold a growing block theory of time. It gets really complicated, like I said, but these are two of the most popular views about how time and persistence go together. And so it's worth noting that there's some sense in which the doctrine of divine conservation, obviously got to fill in the details about how the cause ends up being God, but it's some sense in which on both of these popular views, things need some ongoing concurrent sustaining cause of their existence. It's just interesting to see, right, how on eternalist predominantism, it turns out to be it turns out to be true in a particularly weird way, but eternalist predominantism is weird, so that's what we should expect.
Yeah.
All right, Gil, you ready to follow that?
All right. I mean, yeah. So I'm going to kind of change gears again going from like giving positive arguments against existential inertia. And I'm going to address now the positive arguments that I tend to give in favor of it. So we're going to return back to the arguments I gave in the introduction. So the first argument, if you recall, was that it's for an argument for existential inertia. So that seems intuitive, right? There seems to be nothing coherent about a thing continuing to exist without a concurrent sustaining cause. Again, the father begets a son. The son persists without the father, right? That's a rough analogy. So that seems to be the case. We can seem to imagine or conceive of that taking place. Now, my response to this is I think the reason why it's intuitive is because of two reasons. So I think, is that things regularly persist unless destroyed. So we see that we observe this taking place. So of course it's going to be natural to believe that things have a tendency to persist. Like that's going to be true of both accounts actually. And two, because they think they can imagine a thing existing without a sustaining cause, or at least that's for some, that's one of the reasons why they think this is intuitive, is because they can imagine it, they can conceive of it. But so again, the first thing is that, things having a tendency to exist. That's true under divine conservation, as Aquinas makes clear. Again, that thing has a natural tendency to exist is a necessary condition of persistence, but it's not sufficient. We still need some ultimate explanation, right? And so the second one is that conceiving of something. So it's the problem with that is I think it's like conceiving of something being brought into existence without a cause. Right, Hume did that. So I don't think imagining is the same as providing a coherent account that's grounded in the nature of things. Like once you understand the nature of something, then you have to then provide a case in which that's actually coherent or conceivable, not simply conceive of it in a superficial kind of surface level analysis, which I think is what typically happens when we're talking about Hume, for example. So conceiving of something being brought into existence without a cause actually does seem quite similar to what they're doing, is conceiving of something continuing to exist without a concurrent sustaining cause. There's a certain kind of similarity there, or parallelism there, which I think makes existential inertia a lot more fitting under atheism than theism. So that's why I think as theists, especially if you're a theist, you should probably be pretty hesitant to accept existential inertia, because there seems to be some similarities there, and there seems to be it will naturally lead to that kind of conclusion, or at least under some defenders, for some defenders. So I think that we should have that as a concern. I'm not sure if Chris, if you want to interject or anything or add anything to that, you feel free to.
No, not at the moment. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And the other argument is what they made about simplicity. So I think Swan made a really great point about how it's actually simpler in some cases to say God there's only one entity and one cause of everything, rather than having all these symbols arranged in certain ways, whatever have you, explaining existence. And so I think Joe might appeal to something like a quantum field or something to say that. But even then, when we're talking about quantum fields, we're talking about very complex things. So I'm not going to get too much into that right now. I've already talked about quantum mechanics in a different video. But I think the problem with this, though, I just simply think that arguing from simplicity, whenever I see arguments from this, I think it just seems to put the cart before the horse, because the very thing that we're trying to ask about is whether it has explanatory power, right? That's the issue, whether existential inertia has explanatory power. Not necessarily simplicity. Simplicity should just come along for the ride, I think. at most. It shouldn't take as much prominence. I don't think Joe is making it a prominent thing, but in some cases, in some areas, I've seen it used as a prominent reason to reject a view. Because think about it, you can just posit idealist solipsism. You can just say, I'm the only entity that exists, and I'm also the only kind of entity that exists. So by fiat, that's also simpler than any view that you could ever posit, right? That's simplicity right there. But that presumes a lot of things, first off, and you still have to presume that it has the same explanatory power, which I think is exactly what the issue is. So that's the second argument. The third one, which was the probability, the Bayesian probability argument that Joe gave, not in his paper, but in a video of Micah here. And I just...
He tried to give that argument in the paper, it got cut.
It did? Oh, okay.
It's one of the things that referees do to you. I think it was cut at the insistence of a referee. But yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I think this is a great argument as like an argument if we were launching an argument for like a PSR or something, right? Principle of sufficient reason. I think that's a great argument. But I think it's a terrible argument against classical theism in particular. Again, remember, like flipping a coin 10 times, you said you can get head. If you're getting head 10 times, that's hugely improbable. How probable is that things will continue persist in existence if there's a 50% chance it would exist? Well, if you have God and he has free will, then it seems like that probability is going to be less than 1, which is 0.999. And therefore, then if you have all these billions or trillions of moments, though, and there's a chance in which God could, choose not to sustain it, then it ends up being 0.00001% probability that God will sustain it in existence, right? That's the argument that he's kind of giving here. I just don't think this succeeds because it's acting as if God has like a flower and he is playing with petals, right? He's like, I will you to be, I will you not to be, I will you to be, I will you not to be, or something like that. Like it's just a game or a game of Russian roulette or something.
Just to interject very quickly, it's also presuming again that there's such a thing as each and every moment, a discrete time as we go forward, where separate decisions are being made at each time. It's exactly might also reject that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think fundamentally too, the problem is that that's just not how divine action works, right? When God freely wills something, he freely wills the entirety of creation in one single moment, from beginning to end, if there's even an end, but the entirety of it. God's not simply willing just one part of it and it's like, wait, am I gonna keep this in existence? Maybe, maybe not. No, he's willing everything in one simultaneous moment, right? And so the probability of persistence is actually 1 under divine conservation, right? If we have a classical theist view, especially, it's precisely 1. So I don't think it has any advantage over divine conservation.
Well, we want to say, Gil, we want to say 1, unless there's some cause of discussion, right?
Yes. Okay. That's important. Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we should say that the probability of annihilation is 0. I think that's the right thing to say.
Okay,
so,
that's true.
And this brings me back to stuff that I was reading out of Ott here about the tradition, the theological tradition, right after the biblical sources that I cited. Comes a discussion by Ott concerning whether God would ever annihilate a creature, and Ott says, as God has freely created creatures, he is free also to annihilate them through the withdrawing of his conservating influence, and so allow them to relapse into nothingness. And he cites here 2 Maccabees 8:18. But we trust in the Almighty God who at a beck can utterly destroy the whole world. However, Revelation teaches that in point of fact, God does not desire the complete annihilation of his creatures. And he cites here Wisdom 1:13, God hath not pleasure in the destruction of the living, for he created all things that they might be. I think that the reason why annihilation is ruled out is not, it's just chance, right? It belongs to the integrity of God's rational plan for creation, that he doesn't create a thing with the intention of annihilating it. Right. So, it would be, I think, no more reasonable to run that kind of Bayesian argument against the doctrine of divine conservation than it would be to kind of run a similar argument against like whether your parents love you, right? Like at every moment they could stop loving you. And so over any sufficiently long period of time, enough moments have accumulated that the probability of their having loved you through every moment is close to zero, right? And it's just, it's ignoring what the motivation is behind parents for loving you. They're not doing it by coin toss. With that said, I will note that I haven't read Joe's argument here. And so I leave it to him to say that that's not, in fact, his argument and that he has further things to say. But that argument, whether it's Joe's or not, would be fundamentally flawed in that way. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to note that because I saw him, explain the argument with Micah, but obviously there could be more details that I might have missed or he's included in writing that I haven't read. So, but just on this glance though, that's what it seems like to me. It seems like even if we grant that God could annihilate, like even if we grant that, like say for impossible or something, like say God wanted to create a world in which it lasted for like 10,000 years, right? And it's like boosh, it just goes out of existence. Well, like it's still the case that God's intentional act is to sustain it for 10,000 years, right? And so at every moment in which it exists within that 10,000 years, it's still going to be, I don't know, there's no problem unless otherwise impeded or something internally or something. The existence of the world itself as a whole will persist in existence, and that will be a probability of 1, right? That seems to be the case to me. So I don't quite see this as a compelling argument whatsoever, given if we understand what divine action is, how divine action operates, and in terms of time, like you were pointing out. And so I think that pretty much settles it. Besides, of course, what he might say later about it.
Yeah. Can I also jump back to something you said in your second argument you gave there?
Right.
Which is, you said something about, you mentioned a parallel between something's coming to exist without any cause and something's continuing to exist without a cause. Right. And I think one of the reasons, I think that's a good parallel to note, because one of the reasons we object to something's coming to exist without a cause is because something's coming to exist without a cause would put no constraints on the nature of the thing in question, right? So if anything could come to exist without a cause, then everything could come to exist without a cause. And so, then you could you could raise a parallel objection to things continuing to exist without a cause. You could say, well, what makes it be the case that at every moment in which I continue to exist, having been caused to do so by by my existence at a previous moment, that I continue to exist, as a human being or as a person rather than as any other kind of creature. Right. And of course, the answer that might come to that kind of question might be, well, once you come to exist, you're also come equipped with this causal power to perpetuate your own existence in the way that I think Joe describes in his first account there. But that just raises the question of whether that power to perpetuate one's existence is something that I possess fundamentally, or only as an instrument of, only as an instrument of a God, or whatever the ultimate conserving cause ends up being.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah. And then going that match, we want to go to the next argument then, which was his explanatory power arguments. He had several of them. So the first one is, we do not observe concurrent sustaining causes. Well, again, I think that's false. Chris and I kind of covered that a little bit about our substances when we were talking about it. But even if we did not observe it, suppose we did not, it's also be true that we do not observe existential inertia as a necessary principle. We don't observe the necessary principle itself, right? It's not like, if that's an argument against, our position, then similarly, it should be an argument against existential inertia too, and especially because they say that the data is actually neutral with respect to whether existential inertia divine conservation is true. So then this will just confirm the point that it's not observed, because if the data itself, which is the observational data, is neutral, then, it's only neutral insofar as that there is existential inertia, divine conservation aren't directly observed or something, right? So it's something you have to infer, deduce, or kind of interpret to some extent. So that's one problem, I think, with that kind of appeal to argument. And then even if we're supposing, like, for example, we suppose that a concurrent sustaining cause only occurs at the most fundamental level of realities, and then, which is what we could hold to, essence and existence. It would be absurd to expect that we can observe something because essence and existence is immaterial, right? And so why should we be expecting to observe kind of sustaining concurrent cause, especially when that process is an immaterial one, or that engagement, that participation is immaterial to some extent, right? I don't think it makes sense to say that we should expect to observe it. And that doesn't seem like a good argument, I think, in favor of existential inertia. And then the second one argument is, it says it best explains why we do not see objects randomly or instantly being annihilated at random. So again, I think we already kind of addressed this about the probability. I just don't see it. No, it does not. It doesn't seem to me that it best explains that at all. There's absolutely no advantage that existential inertia has over divine conservation here, right? They're both equal on this regard. So I don't understand why he thinks that best explains it, but maybe I just misunderstanding there. And then the third one is that he says, it best explains why we ordinarily explain the existence of a banana on the table at T2 in terms of it existing yesterday. No one moves it off the table, so therefore nothing's destroying it, so we don't appeal to any sustaining cause. I just think that that's not true. These are just proximate explanations, right? We're just talking about something in particular, the state of affairs, explaining the state of affairs in which the banana is on the table. In such cases, we are not explaining its existence as such, right? We're not explaining existence itself. We're rather simply explaining a state of affairs of that being on the table. And it seems like divine conservation is perfectly compatible with this, explains this equally well, right? In terms of scientific and ordinary ways of explaining things. So metaphysics simply is more concerned with something a lot more fundamental than that. And the other argument he gives was, again, diachronic identity. I guess we kind of really covered that again already before, though, but I just think that, again, it just seems that he's understanding time like as a discrete thing, and that God is creating it ex nihilo at every single moment, but that doesn't seem to make any sense at all, because that's just not opposite of what conservation means. And then the other thing is he kind of mentions, this is a negative argument, he kind of mentions how Thomistic metaphysics is controversial, and he's kind of making this as kind of almost like a negative point against our position. So, because in doing so, we're presupposing our own kind of metaphysic. But I think the converse is true. Like, you're just presupposing your own controversial analytic metaphysic. That's controversial too, especially your assumptions about existence and stuff. And so that's the very thing at question. I don't think that's anything. That does nothing to discount our view. I think it's just a little bit dismissive in some way. It will also not do contrariety when he was saying that homeomorphism depends on part on whether things have existential inertia. That doesn't, I think that's just false, right? Because homeomorphism is independently motivated, right? It's motivated by the fact that we need to explain change and persistence of material objects, and how is it that something persists through substantial or accidental change, right? That's the motivation, that's independent motivation. And so to posit existential inertia wouldn't seem to undermine it at all. You know, you kind of just, I don't know, it doesn't seem like a compelling argument to me. I guess one of the things you might say is like, well, there are three principles, and we might have like matter, form, and then there's a third principle. We call it existential inertia, the third principle. And I just think that, well, okay, if you're going to introduce a third principle, you're going to have to show what it does differently than, say, essence and existence as principles of being, right? Because existential inertia seems to be parasitic on the principle of existence, right? I don't see how it does anything. It seems to kind of multiply entities beyond necessity, or multiply principles in this case beyond necessity. So I think that's problematic. So I think the point is, if you do take issue with Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, then no, again, like as we said at the beginning, it's not as if we have failed to provide an argument that works against existential inertia. It works insofar as you understand how the metaphysic works, and you assume or accept the metaphysics. Rather, the issue is simply whether you accept the metaphysic in the first place. And so that's why I do think it's so important for us to do metaphysics. The best argument against existential inertia is simply to do metaphysics. Because once we examine the metaphysical nature of things, we see that existential inertia is impossible. It doesn't make any sense. So that would be a brief kind of like rebuttal of those arguments that I gave at the beginning. I could say more. I'm not sure if Christopher wants to say something in addition to what I just said, or adding.
Let me just say, let's start getting into like wrapping up our comments, because we're about to hit, I mean, like almost 2 hours and 2.5 hours. So Christopher,
yeah, for sure.
Okay, yeah, I will wrap up everything that I had to say by giving one more objection to what Joe calls his second account, and one more very brief positive argument for the doctrine of divine conservation that will probably only appeal to Christians, but I imagine that most of this discussion around existential inertia probably appeals only mostly to Christians anyway. The objection I have is that Joe talks in his second account as if he speaks in his second account as if a positing of a metaphysical necessity is an explanatory dead end, or if not dead end, an appropriate place to stop. Let's put it that way. I think this is very wrong. The metaphysical necessity of a thing does not do any work to explain it. Now, of course, you could just concede that it's a brute metaphysical necessity, but I think it's wrong to say that because something's metaphysically necessary, it doesn't stand in need of explanation, it doesn't call out for explanation, or that its metaphysical necessity just explains itself. That's not. I don't think that's right, because in part because modal notions and explanatory notions are very different, right? Something's being metaphysically necessary is a modal claim. Something's being explained or not explained is a very different kind of claim. So, for example, it's metaphysically necessary that water is H2O. I don't think that you certainly won't see chemists tell you that that is the end of the explanation about why water why water is H2O, right? They're going to say, well, H2O bond in a certain way with each other that generates these properties of what we denote as water. Or, you could say that it's metaphysically necessary to use another example, that there are no golden mountains, right? Because it turns out that gold's chemical properties are such that it couldn't build a whole mountain out of it. It's too soft. And its chemical physical properties are metaphysically necessary to it, right? But that's clearly not self-explanatory just because it's metaphysically necessary, right? You'd have to go talk again, right, to like a chemist or a physicist about why gold, what makes gold soft exactly, and how does that softness contribute to its being unable to make mountains out of it, and so on. Or, right, to use the example of God, why does God exist? It's metaphysically necessary that he exists. That's true. But we actually give an explanation in terms of his essence and not being distinct. So I think it's true that metaphysical necessities admit of explanations, and I think it's also obvious that they often require explanations. If not always, then at least often. And then, so here's one other argument against existential inertia, or in favor of the doctrine of divine conservation, that some Christians may find helpful, right? It's traditional Christian doctrine that the divine creative power is incommunicable. That is, not even God could make a creature have the power on its own to create ex nihilo, right? It's incommunicable to creatures. But what it would be for a causal series to be per accidens, such that God creates some creature and that creature itself could be capable of creating another creature and so on, without relying back upon God for its own existence or that creative power, would be for the creative power to be communicated, right? Just like what makes it be the case that, my father generating me and me generating a son is a per accidens series, is the fact that when my father generates me, he communicates to me all the powers necessary for me to generate a son, to continue existing and generate a son of my own. So humanity, together with its reproductive powers, those are communicable attributes. And that's exactly what my Father does. He communicates those attributes to me when he generates me. And then I communicate them to my Son, and so on. And that's what makes it a per accident series, is that each member communicates to each subsequent member all the powers possessed in its own right necessary to perpetuate the series. Whereas in a per se series, we don't find that. We find that the power is always on loan from each member of the series, from the previous member all the way back to the first member, right? And so if you accept, right, this traditional Christian doctrine that the creative power is incommunicable, then what we find is that you can't make a per accident series out of the creative act, so to speak, right, where God just creates the thing in its first instant, and that thing at that instant is causally responsible ex nihilo for the existence of the same thing at the next moment, and so on and so forth, because that would be a communication of the creative power. Because things can possess the power as their own from moment to moment in this way, you can't generate a per accident series. It has to be per se. And so the existence of things at every moment that they exist always ends up getting traced back to the causal activity of the first divine, creative, and sustaining cause.
Good. I don't know if I can just have one last thing just to add to what you were saying about necessity and explanation and everything. Because I know like Joe probably might say something about like, yeah, it's going to be a primitive kind of necessary fact that things persist, right? I think that's going to be his view that he's going to end up going into. And so I think it's important to note that his view is not an absolute necessity, right? Because things will persist unless it's impeded. So it's kind of like a conditional necessity. But I think when we're asked about the metaphysical conditional necessity, we have to ask, well, in virtue of what does that conditional necessity obtain though? That's a perfectly legitimate question, because again, when we're asking about the necessity and contingency, what are the natures of these things? So Thomas is going to analyze them in terms of the essence and existence distinction, right? We're going to understand necessity in terms of these relations or something and something like that, of that sort. So for someone who posits that it's simply a metaphysically necessary fact that there's a conditional necessity of existential inertia, well, we have to explain what it is, right? Well, when virtue of what is that the case? And so that they would deny explicitly that's a power or a property, right? But it's not absolutely metaphysically necessary the way that God would be, because it can still fail to exist. So it's not an absolute necessity. So then where does that conditional necessity come from again? And so I think the only way in which I can see something similar to what they're saying is like a property, like risability, right? It seems like risability is something it's necessary. It's a conditional necessity in some sense, because once you have it, it derives from the essence of a thing. Once you have it, it has ability that you can impede it in some way, right? We can imagine certain cases in which, something natural impedes your ability to laugh. And so that could occur, right? And so, but that property, risability is a property that flows out of the essence of a thing, right? That's how we account for the conditional necessity of risability. But we don't have such an account though for conditional necessity of existential inertia, right? Because you've already denied that existence is a property, a disposition, or a power. So, but then yet at the same time, you seem to treat existence as if it was a property, as it was some kind of disposition or power that can be impeded, right? That necessarily flows out of the essence of a thing or something. So what do you have left? You seem to have almost like a hopeless contradiction in terms of being able to explain in virtue of what does that conditional necessity obtain. And I think that's a really important thing that thus Thomas can make, a point that we can make, because it's emphasizing the ontology of something.
All right. And with that, I think if everyone's satisfied, I think we can wrap up the episode there. Wow. Yep. I mean, like 2.5 hours of just going in existential inertia. Yeah, I had such a great time. Thank you, Gil, for coming on to the show. Thank you, Christopher, for coming on again, too.
Awesome. Thank you, Swan.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, with that, I have nothing else to say. I think basically everything that has to be said has been said. And with that, I'm just going to say thank you for watching.
All right.